Right, I think we can get started. So, hi everyone. My name's Emily Hickson, and I am the Director of Business and Investor Engagement for Climate Catalyst. For those that don't know Climate Catalyst, we are a new NGO tackling tricky climate challenges and mobilizing actors to push for policy change and emissions reductions in these topics. And since early 2022, we've been running a campaign to protect and restore European peatland. So peatland, as you might know, and I didn't until I started working in this area, is a vital ecosystem for both nature and climate, which doesn't always exert the star power of other ecosystems like forests and oceans, but they're incredibly important because of their emission storage role. And when drained and degraded, they release emissions. So in the EU alone, over 50% of our peatlands are degraded. And it's often difficult for corporates to assess whether they're operating on drained peatland and how to then identify, account, and disclose those emissions from that drained peatland. So that is what led us to examine the existing and emerging frameworks for accounting, disclosing, and target setting for nature. And that is what the impetus of this webinar today is, to communicate on the suite of those frameworks, how they fit together, and how companies can start using them. And we, as I say, have a special interest in corporates using those to protect and restore peatland, but of course, they are vital to restoring nature across the board. So if we go to the next slide. So we've got an hour and a half together today. So we're going to, and we've got some really good speakers coming up who are going to introduce us to the frameworks and how they relate to one another. And I know that's been a big question that we get from a lot of businesses. We're going to hear from two businesses on the call, Wholesome and Nestle, today, about how they are implementing the frameworks and, of course, importantly, how they're taking action to restore nature. We're going to hear from Finance for Biodiversity, who are kind of doing us a bit of a sneak peek into their climate nature nexus report and the findings within that. And then, of course, we're going to leave half an hour for Q&A with the panel. So please do, in the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom panel, ask questions from the start, as you react to what the panelists are saying, and I will look at those as we go through and then group them, and we'll get going with those for the panel. So that's our agenda. Just go to the next slide. So just a very quick recap of when I say the frameworks, what am I talking about? So this webinar today is mainly centering around 4 frameworks that have come to be in the last couple of years and are still kind of evolving and emerging. So, of course, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the kind of recently released, and in kind of draft form, land sector removals guidance. The Science-Based Targets Initiative's FLAG guidance, so that's forest, land and agriculture guidance. The Science-Based Targets Network, so their science-based targets for nature. And last but not least, the Taskforce on nature-related financial disclosures, which just had its launch last week. So that's what we're looking at today. So before we begin, we thought it would be useful to take a little baseline poll to assess your familiarity with these frameworks. So that's the first question. So you should see it pop up on your screen. It's popping up on mine. So please let us know which ones you are familiar with. You can select all that apply. And then the second question, and this is really for businesses only, or businesses and financial institutions, those which would actually be implementing these frameworks, using these frameworks, and then, of course, implementing action off the back of them. Tell us how you're using these, if at all. So we'll just give a couple of moments more for participants to do that, and then we'll have a look at the results together. Okay. Alex, I think we're ready for the results. Excellent. Okay. So hopefully you can all, everybody can see these results. So I think it's, a mixed amount of familiarity with the different frameworks there. And that's okay, because that's why you've turned up to this webinar, to learn more. And again, a bit of a mixed picture on how businesses are starting to think about using them. But quite a low percentage there of those who are not considering using them at all. So that's good. Excellent. So that's our baseline. And I hope that if we took this poll in an hour and a half time, at least on the familiarity factor, those scores would go up. And we've got an excellent set of speakers, as I say, who are going to kind of guide us through some of this. Excellent. So actually, without further ado, I will pass over to our first presenter. So that's Martha Stevenson, Senior Director of Strategy and Research in the Forest team at WWF US, who's going to provide us an overview on how specifically the GHG Protocol, the Science Based Target Initiative's flag guidance, and the science-based targets for land fit together and provide businesses with a process for accounting, disclosing, and setting targets to reduce their negative impacts and, of course, increase their positive impacts on nature. So over to you, Martha.
Great. Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Climate Catalyst, for having me here today. So I have been asked, I'm going to start my timer real quick. I've been asked to cover these 3 different frameworks and reflect on how they work together to address impacts from land use change and also land management, and looking also across climate and nature. First slide, please. So just as kind of background and context, I'm sure folks know this, but land use change or deforestation or conversion of natural habitat, as we usually refer to it, is significant both when we look at climate impacts and nature impacts. We estimate that it contributes 11% to global greenhouse gas emissions. And when we look at biodiversity, terrestrial biodiversity impacts, land use change causes 33% of negative impacts. This is from the IPCC and, of course, the IPBES, kind of the 2 scientific bodies that support the UN conventions on climate and biodiversity. Next slide. But often there is a real focus on land use change, transformation of land, and we forget the important role that land management plays. So from a climate perspective, how we use the land can contribute an equal amount or another 11% of emissions for global greenhouse gases. And then on the biodiversity side, even more intense or severe, where we see how we use the land contributing up to over half of the impacts to terrestrial biodiversity. This includes things like pollution, runoff, invasive species, unsustainable management, including overexploitation. And so you can see that making sure we have adequate frameworks to address land use change and land management impacts benefits us both from a climate and nature perspective. Next slide. So here are the 3 standards that I'll be reviewing today. 1 is an accounting standard and 2 are target setting standards. So the first is the greenhouse gas protocol. Well, and I guess should say kind of the whole picture of all of these and how they work together is really to align corporate ambition with global goals. And so whether that's aligning global ambition with the Paris Agreement and even beyond to 1.5 degree pathways on the climate side, or aligning companies with the Convention on Biological Diversity and all of the subsequent targets that we have embedded in there for companies. So that's the big picture framing of why we develop these frameworks, what is their main purpose. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is an accounting standard. It's been around for about 20 years, and it provides the standard for how companies know to estimate their emissions annually within their baseline. There's about 20 different standards within this suite, so there's a lot of them. I'm talking here specifically about the corporate standard and the Scope 3 standard. As Emily mentioned, there is also the land sector and removals guidance standard that is currently in development. And this is where I'll focus today, given the focus on land. Maybe one more thing important to mention, and you'll kind of hear this throughout the talk, that, originally Greenhouse Gas Protocol focused on providing guidance to measure energy emissions and industrial emissions. We are just for the first time releasing guidance that will help companies measure their biogenic carbon emissions, really looking at the land sector. So we have 20 years of practice on the other, and we don't even have the standard finished for land sector emissions. So it's going to take us a little while. We kind of have training wheels in terms of land sector emissions. So I think we all just need to give ourselves grace as we try to do this the best that we can, given the lack of standards, the lack of data. The second framework is Science-Based Targets Initiative. I was interested to see in the survey that it seems like kind of low literacy on climate and higher with nature with this crowd, which is exciting. Usually it's always the reverse. So this is a nice challenge for me. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative started in 2014. And this is a target setting methodology for companies to align either their corporate inventory or their portfolios. There are financial standards as well with 1.5 degree pathways. And then the Science-Based Targets Network was established kind of in a similar way to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. This is really focused on these nature standards and how companies can set nature targets to align their goals with these global nature goals. Next slide. So all three of these standards they kind of build on one another and they address different things. So if we start with the traditional kind of SBTi target, this is the first one that was launched in 2014. You have both near-term targets that are between 5 and 10 years, and you have long-term targets that are also called net zero targets. Those goes out 20 to 30 years. Those historically have really covered only fossil emissions and industrial emissions. And again, there's a lot of sector-specific tools within this framework of standards, but that's the traditional science-based targets. And we have over 6,000 companies now who have committed to setting these targets, with about 3,500 of them having gone through the SBTi's validation process. So really significant uptake of this standard. The next one is the SBTi flag standard. And so this is the one that was just launched last year in 2022. And I led the development of this standard with my team, and it covers deforestation and conversion emissions and all other land management biogenic emissions, and uses the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as the backbone for the accounting. So that's how the two are connected. And then the SBTN land standard, this is the more recent one. So we just launched in May 2023, the draft standard. It covers conversion of natural habitat, land use metrics and shrinking footprint, and also landscape engagement. We link to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in some places. We provide accounting guidance within the document itself for other things. And this document is currently in piloting mode. So there are 17 companies who are piloting this during this year. I know Wholesome is one of them who's with us today. And so this is a very much kind of in process type of standard for now. Next slide, please. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Land Sector and Removals Guidance, and the SBTi flag tool, they were developed together, and they were both funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard, it's a very lengthy document and quite technical, but that's just to get kind of what it is. It's a list of criteria, both requirements and recommendations of how companies should conduct their greenhouse gas inventory with regard to the land sector and removals. On the flag side, this again is a guidance document of criteria. If you want to submit a science-based target to SBTi for validation, you would need to make sure that you comply with those criteria. And then we also have an Excel file where you can calculate what your annual emission reduction would need to be in line with 1.5 degree targets. Next slide. So here's a visual of what a typical ambition cycle looks like. First, you would use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard to measure and account your corporate baseline. Then you would take that inventory data, input it into the Excel file for SBTi, and that would tell you how much your annual reduction needs to be in order to align with science. Typically, you would report or disclose that target on a platform like CDP or within TCFD or another disclosure or CSR report. Then the most important part where you actually get started on the work. So you're either reducing impacts, or because the land sector involves managing photosynthetic species, we're also removing carbon from the atmosphere as part of the pathways here. So you would do both of those activities, and then you update on a regular cycle, not necessarily annually. Next slide, please. So we'll go one more click down into the climate side. So just to talk about what types of emissions and activities are covered by a greenhouse gas protocol and flag. So we have land use change. So that's CO2 from deforestation, degradation, conversion of wetlands, grasslands, peatland burning, and savannas. And then for land management, we have CO2, methane, and N2O, looking at different management practices from soils to fertilizer, enteric, and manure. And then we have removals. As I said, this is really different from other sectors where we're just reducing. We're also removing here in this sector. That includes removals from forest restoration, silvopasture, integrating tree systems into pasture, improved forest management, agroforestry, and different soil practices. And then just to add a note, right now in the draft land sector guidance, both product use phase and end of life are considered outside of the scope. So we don't want to incentivize companies kind of cutting down trees, burying them in landfills, and then counting that as removal. So that's where the current status is on that. Next slide. This is my last slide. Just one click down in on the nature side to give a little bit more visibility into what they cover. So first, very similar to the climate targets, no conversion of natural ecosystems. And we have that clearly outlined here. The second target is looking at land footprint reduction. And so this is aimed at large agricultural companies. We know we need to free up land both for biodiversity and for climate. And so we need to take some of the pressure off those areas that have expanded significantly. And we saw in the most recent update to the safe and just planetary boundaries that we have way overgone by about 15%. Conversion of natural habitats, we need to bring that back as quickly as possible to stay within Earth's limits. And then the last one is target 3, which is the landscape engagement boundary target, excuse me. And this one is really exciting because it's loosely written to really make sure that we are incentivizing those positive actions at a landscape scale that can incentivize the avoid and reduce of targets 1 and 2. And one thing we really learned from climate right now on the climate side, we have in supply chain actions and landscape actions in 2 different frameworks. And so they compete with each other, and it causes a lot of tension over who gets the finance. Here on the nature side, we learned from that. We put them all within the same framework, the same incentive structure to make sure that they're actually a yes and strategy and working together. I'll stop there and I look forward to questions. Thanks.
Brilliant, Martha. A real tour de force in 9 minutes of how these quite complicated frameworks fit together. And I really like the ambition to action cycle graphic. I think it's really clear how these are different steps, but over time you have to go back and redo them again as the frameworks evolve and as your strategy evolves, and indeed as impacts on nature evolve. So thank you for that. So next we'll hear from Marianne Haar, who's the technical sector guidance lead at the Taskforce for nature-related financial disclosures. So Marianne, you must be very tired from the launch of the guidance last week, and indeed actually the sprint that you have been on for the last 2.5 years to get the TNFD to this point. So can you tell us about the TNFD guidance, the process, and why it's important?
Definitely, and thank you so much for the invitation, Emily. And we're actually continuing because we are launching, we're having the European launch next week on the 2nd of October in Geneva at Building Bridges. So we hope to see a lot of you there to celebrate and discuss it further with us. And just as Martha only had 10 minutes, I also only have 10 minutes. So it will be a pretty quick flyover, but I'm really pleased that we have Nestle and Wholesome here who can bring it more to life because they've been very engaged task force members. So yeah, next slide, please. So TNFD really set out on a journey. Next slide, please. So TNFD set out on this journey back in 2021, acting on a G7 mandate to design a risk, impact, and opportunity management framework. And that's where we differ from TCFD. That was only a material risk management framework, but we also added the opportunity side to the framework. And as you see on the slide, you see the task force members, the 40 task force members, because we've really designed the framework not for the market, but with the market. So we've deployed what we call an open innovation process. That's what you see on the stairs there on the slide. So we've used this analogy to software development of beta versions. So basically, we've developed drafts with the task force, and we've launched those to the market, almost like our homework, and said, is this how we do it? You know, does this reflect best science and best practice? And as you see, we stand on the top of the stairs because we are September 2023, and we have left 4 beta versions behind, and now we launched the final version. And our next sort of wave of work will be around transition planning, and also around diving further into the sectors. But it's important to say that unlike what we just heard from Martha, the TNFD is a framework and not a standard. So in that sense, we are very complementary to what you just heard from Martha. Next slide, please. So there is also what we heard in the beginning, I think from you, Emily, that there is a global architecture unfolding these years. And some of the main questions we get is, what's the interoperability between them? Is it just that we have to report on a lot of different standards in different jurisdictions, or what's going on? And the TNFD is really here to drive consolidation. So if you see on this very simplified overview, the role that we try to play, you have on the top, you have the global goals on nature and climate. And below these, you have the corporate reporting framework that translates these policy goals into risk and opportunity disclosure approaches. And then you have underneath that and linked to that the standards, just as we heard, the SBTi's helping you to set targets related to your disclosures on climate, and SBTN on nature. And then these frameworks are currently informing the development of the standards, such as the S2 on the ISSB for climate, but also in the future for nature, but also those regulatory standards that are coming out. The CSRD, for instance, the biodiversity side of that is very aligned to the TNFD, and also the ESRS that are coming at the sector level from the EU. So really our intention is to be that global interoperable framework where you can compare nature performance of different companies across jurisdictions. And then there will be some companies that will disclose much more in depth if they're in a regulatory environment that tells them to do so. Next slide, please. And now I really want to turn to what we released last week on Monday. So this is basically the stack that you have under the TNFD framework of content. So we have the disclosure recommendations on top. Then we responded to the market's need to say, nature is quite complex. I mean, carbon and climate is also complex, but where do we start with nature? So we issued a getting started guidance. And then we also have guidance on our how-to guidance, which is called the LEAP. And you can find all of this on our website. So I will just encourage you, rather than spend too much time on this slide, to go and visit our website. Next slide, please. And the next slide is really the 14 disclosure recommendations. And as you see, we have designed the TNFD at a design level completely to mirror the TCFD. And that is really to incentivize integrated reporting. So, and we have adapted all the 11 TCFD disclosure recommendations to nature. And then we have added 3 more, because there are some ways nature behaves differently in a business model or a portfolio than climate. And one of these is what you see under strategy D, so that nature is very localized, where here we have a disclosure recommendation which is not adapted from TCFD, which is around disclosing the localization of your assets or business activities, because whether you consume a liter of water in Egypt versus in Finland will have completely different impacts on nature. So therefore localization is extremely important. But really we've designed the framework so that if you disclose according to these 14 disclosure recommendations, that you are essentially replying to target 15 of the global biodiversity framework of disclosure requirements. Next slide, please. In addition to the 14 disclosure requirement, we also launched 6 general requirements, which you need to take into account across all the 14 requirements. And you see these 6 here listed on the slide. I won't go into all of them, just highlight 2 of them that have generated quite a lot of discussion. And one is that organizations need to be transparent about the approach to materiality, so that the market can actually assess when you see your impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities, what type of materiality lens are you deploying as a company. And another one to highlight is the discussion around scopes. So we're not using the scopes terminology directly from climate, because the scope 2 doesn't make too much sense. We use direct, upstream, and downstream. And here we have a general requirements that organizations should provide a description of the scopes that are covered in their disclosure, and also what is the intention and timeline of covering a larger scope in the coming disclosure statements aligned to TNFD. Next slide, please. So really the big discussion, of course, is around the metrics in the disclosure framework under the metrics and target pillar, so pillar number 4. And they are really at the core of the framework. We have put the IPBES 5 drivers of biodiversity loss that the GPF is also designed around. So you really need to be able to connect your portfolio or your business model to the 5 impact drivers and quantify these. So how much is your business model driving of land conversion, which is relevant to this discussion, in square kilometers against the baseline, etc. But the same for the other 4 drivers. And then apply scenario analysis to translate into business risks and opportunities, and also quantify these, as you will see in the metrics on the next slide, please. So for the TNFD, this slide shows you what's the metrics design. And the design of the metrics is, if you start at the bottom of the triangle here, you have metrics that are around dependencies and impacts. And then you have metrics that are aggregate metrics around the risks and opportunities, quantitative, that your business model is driving. So if you are to do a TNFD aligned disclosure statement, there is a minimum number of metrics that you need to disclose on. And in the TNFD, you see here that it's 14. And I'll just give you a sneak peek, so I won't go through all of them, but next slide, you can get an understanding of what that encompasses. So we have made different core metrics requirements for financial service institutions and for real economy corporates. There are 2 core for financial service institutions that you see here that all needs to disclose on. Then FIs are also expected, in addition, to disclose on 5 core global risks and opportunity metrics, and with time also on the impact driver metrics, but that depends on, of course, when they get the information from the real economy corporates. Next slide, please, where you will see the aggregate risk and opportunity metrics. So the first one on risk, for instance, is value of assets, liabilities, revenue, and expenses that are assessed as vulnerable to nature-related transition risks. And then you have the same for physical risks. And then you have opportunity metrics. So these are really aggregate on your business model and your portfolio. And what do you then need to aggregate up? That's your impact drivers, which we have on the next slide. And we have 9 impact drivers that are core metrics that all needs to disclose on. And the first 2 are land related. So I think they're most interesting for this conversation. So you can read them here, that the first one is really around your total spatial footprint in square kilometer. And it's both, and it's both in your direct and your value chain. And then the second one is really on more on conversion. And then we go through impact drivers around related to the other 4 impact drivers of IPBES, and they are all living up to the ISSB metrics requirements of being quantifiable and being material. Next slide, please. So these next slides, I think they are all the metrics. We don't have time to go through them. We can discuss them more later. And then we have the state of nature metrics, which are, of course, you need to, if you are to translate the impact drivers your business model is driving, or the impacts you're driving. It may translate into a risk in some jurisdictions, but not in others. So if you have excess release to freshwater of nutrients in an area where it's into nutrient poor freshwater ecosystem, you will not necessarily generate eutrophication. But if you do it in nutrient dense freshwater areas, you will create eutrophication, right? So you need to assess your impact driver in order to translate it into a risk against the state of nature. It's the least mature part of the framework, so that's why we just have 2 placeholder metrics that we would like the market to discuss further with us. And this is on ecosystem condition and species extinction risk. So these are what we will really like to discuss further. Next slide, please. And I think that's the last slide, actually. Yeah. So this is just to show to you that I think most of you probably know our how-to guidance, which is called LEAP. It's a 4-phase process. It's not mandatory under the TNFD. It's just a how-to guidance of how can you get the insights that you need from your business in order to be able to disclose on the 14 requirements. So it's a helping hand. It's not a mandatory approach, but we made an update, and you can also find that on the website. So thank you so much. I think there's no more slides from my side. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Marianne. And I'm a big fan of the LEAP framework. It's it feels pretty intuitive. And I like that guidance that you had at the top of the slide there. You can kind of get started by doing a kind of quick assessment before you go in. And I also particularly like what you said about by following your framework, you are replying to target 15 of the global biodiversity framework. And so that's a way that the business community can obviously play their part in reaching a big global goal on biodiversity. So next, and actually Michael will probably touch on this, we'll hear from Michael Offosuhen-Wise. Mike, I hope I pronounced that right, probably not, from Business for Nature. And Michael, you can tell us a bit about how Business for Nature is advising businesses to respond and take up the guidance in the frameworks like the TNFD and SBTi flag, and yeah, what you think leadership looks like here. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Emily. It's a pleasure to be presenting here. My name is Michael Offosuhen-Wise with Business for Nature. And for those that do not know Business for Nature, we are a global coalition of business organizations as well as leading businesses. And together we work to accelerate credible and ambitious business action, as well as policy ambition to help contribute to a nature positive future by 2030. So a lot of work is focused on speeding and scaling our business action, but also driving ambitious policy. And my presentation today will actually take a step back, because we've heard a lot of, detailed resources from both Martha and Marianne around SBTN, SBTi, SBTi flag, as well as TNFD. And it's very clear that there's a plethora of resources for companies to get started on action. But it was really interesting when you did the poll, Emily, at the beginning of this, to see that about 43 to 46% of this room alone are just getting started and really want to understand, how do we navigate all of this? How do we navigate this really complex landscape of nature action? And we've done a lot of work with both leading companies and our partners to think through. But before we get into that, just to set the context, if you go on the next slide, it was very clear, and you alluded to this, Emily, that in December, governments adopted the historic UN Global Biodiversity Framework in Montreal. That, along with, of course, all the other agreements on nature, will give society and economies the chance to become a more resilient economy and to thrive within nature's limits. We, as a business community, really contributed to that global landmark agreement in December, where we now have long-term direction from governments around what we need to do to contributing to halting and reversing nature loss by 2030. Which is essentially also how we contribute towards the delivery of a nature positive future. So now is really the time. We are at a kind of inflection point. We have the policy landscape set. We are at an action inflection point where we must encourage companies to step up and take action on nature. And it's very clear that businesses have a critical role to play. Businesses have the resources, they have the agility, they have the ability to move at speed and at scale to really transform the global economy. And as we can see from the previous presenters, there's a lot of resources to help us get started. And for Business for Nature, working with companies, the question that we kept getting was that this landscape is very complicated. How do we help the companies that are really at the beginning of their journey to understand at a very high level, how can I take this to, for example, my board, my CEOs, to understand how to act on nature? So on the next slide, this was an exercise that we did and launched last year in Davos together with the Capitals Coalition, Science-Based Targets Network, TNFD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the World Economic Forum, WWF, and many of our partners that are heavily involved in developing all of these resources that have been presented, the TNFD recommendations, the SBTN targets on nature, SBTi flag, and as well as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We developed what is now called the high-level business actions on nature. For a lot of companies that are working and a lot of partners that are working in this space, we loosely use the acronym ACT-D, which stands for Assess, Commit, Transform, and Disclose. It's almost a journey towards reporting on nature. So while it's not an iterative step in the sense that you don't need to start from Assess, Commit, Transform to Disclose, you can, as a business, plug into this wheel of action. And essentially, what we're asking companies to do, and we realize that this is consistent across all the different tools and resources that are already out there, is that companies will need to assess, in this sense, measuring and valuing, as well as prioritizing their impacts and dependencies on nature to ensure that they are really acting on the most material impacts. Once the company has a good understanding of their material impact and dependencies, then they're in an informed position to set science-aligned or science-based targets to put their company on the right track towards reducing their impact and dependency. And then the bulk of the work, of course, then is in how they transform their business operations to avoid and reduce their negative impacts, as well as restore and regenerate. How do they shift business strategies and models? And then also, like you mentioned, Emily, work with governments to shape and advocate for nature positive ambition. You can see that the disclose is going around each of these actions because it's really at the core of driving accountability, transparency, and as Marianne mentioned, is really embedded in strategy, is embedded in governance, it's embedded in transformation, is really embedded in all that assessment. So the work that TNFD and many other disclosure agencies are doing is to make sure that at each stage of this journey to assess, commit, and transform, you're able to disclose to the relevant stakeholders. This has become the high-level actions that is driving a lot of the work for Business for Nature to help companies at the beginning of their journey to frame how they act on nature. If we go to the next slide, building on the high-level actions, we're now in the stage where we're working with companies to leverage that framing to speed and scale up business action. So just last week, for those that were in New York, Business for Nature, together with the World Economic Forum and WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and of course, with input from partners, expert companies, we have released 12 sector-specific overviews that really focus on the specific actions companies can take within their businesses to contribute to a nature-positive future. So on the assess and commitment piece, we know that there is a lot of resources, but specifically for companies that are starting their nature journey, we wanted to give them very tangible sector-specific actions that they can take. So if you're a company within the fashion industry, what are those specific actions you can start now to reduce your negative impacts and to accelerate your positive impacts. So this is work that was launched in New York just last week, and thanks to all the partners that supported us to do that. In addition to that, what we're working on is a campaign which we'll be launching in November to accelerate corporate action on nature, and also to keep the momentum from COP15 alive. Like I mentioned, we've now mobilized so many companies to call on governments to deliver. Now is the time for companies to also start working on their corporate strategies to accelerate action on nature. So more to come on this business action campaign that we're working on. Just to conclude, wanted to, on the next slide, which is also my last slide, I believe, just a few things to keep in mind for companies that are starting their journey that wants to act on nature and contribute to a nature positive future. Just 3 high-level actions is to avoid greenwashing. We know that nothing undermines the credibility of business pro-nature credentials than making claims that are either exaggerated, misleading, or false. So we're really encouraging companies to be very specific on exactly what they're doing and not making sort of blanket statements like we are nature positive or we are doing things that are not necessarily verifiable within their nature strategies. And also to signal the urgency that don't delay and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It is very clear that we have enough to get started. Martha shared 3 different frameworks: Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the SBTi flag, SBTN, and Marianne has talked about the TNFD framework in detail. We have a lot of resources to get us started. And then to end with the need to collaborate. There are so many partners from the business and NGO communities, as well as consultants, that are happy and willing to work with companies that are on the journey. So on that note, I think there's no better time to start action than now. Happy to hand over back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Michael. And I really like the message of this slide, which is just get going. Don't promise the earth. Literally don't do that, but just get going. And this webinar should be, part of that, helping to kind of remove some of the complexity and help companies have a think about where they'd start. And also, I just wanted to call out that very clear ambition loop that you articulated, Michael, which I think is what Business for Nature is really good at. It's really helping kind of aggregate the stories of where businesses are taking action, where they are using these frameworks to set targets, disclose, and of course, then act on those impacts. And then by using those stories, we can build the confidence of policymakers to put the enabling policies in place for business to take more action. And you create this kind of positive circle. And I think the campaign in the lead up to COP15 last year was a good example of that. So we're going to go to 2 business case studies, and thanks everyone for bearing with us, but this is really rich content. So Renata Polini, can we go to you? So you're head of nature at Holcim. And so why don't you tell us how you've kind of approached your risks and responsibilities in restoring nature, and how you've used the frameworks that we've discussed just now to guide that action. Over to you.
Yes, sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Emily and the team, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and it's very good to see many of our partners in the same call. So we can go to the next slide. Because before we deep dive into Holcim nature strategy, I would like to make a brief introduction about Holcim, so everyone in the call will understand better our connection to climate and nature. So we are aiming to be a global leader in innovative and sustainable building solutions. We produce cement, aggregates, concrete, roofing materials, facades. In short, we are producing materials which are going to be used in construction. We are present all over the world with more or less 6,000 employees, a revenue of 29 billion Swiss francs. And we are working very deeply in the innovation to innovate our products. If you go to the next slide. So here on the left side of the slide, you see our main business segments in terms of revenue. And there is where we have most of our nature and climate impacts. On the right side, you see some segments that we are growing significant on the past year. And just to highlight, if you are not aware, concrete is the second most consumed material in the world after water. And according to the WEF, the construction material sector is one of the top three main industries highly dependent on nature. In addition to that, I think we all know that our sector is one of the main contributors to the greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to do something about that. If you go to the next slide. Also to put into the perspective, today we have 1.6 billion people that do not have a proper roof or a proper access to sanitation. In the next 30 years, we expect 2.5 billion of people moving to the cities. And the issue is that 60% of this infrastructure does not exist. If you do the way that we are doing today, if you continue to build the way that we are doing today, by 2040, we will be using every year 2.3 planets, which I hope we all agree it's not the way to go. So we need to rethink how we build. And if you go to the next slide, we at Hosting are trying to do that, to shift the way that we are building. In the sustainability team, we are focused on 4 pillars, which is climate and energy, circular economy, nature, and people. In the climate pillar, we have our scope 1, 2, 3 targets are validated by the SBTi, and we want to do the same on the nature pillar. I'm leading the nature pillar, and for Hosting, we are prioritizing 2 elements. One is fresh water, and another one is biodiversity inland. And important to say that we launched our nature strategy in 2021. And at that time, I think it's not, there's not needed to say, but of course, SBTN, the Science Based Target for Nature, and also TNFD were not ready. So we were very bold to publish measurable commitments. And I'm going to show you now a little bit what we publish and how we plan to improve them. Next slide. So just some insights on our nature strategy. As I said, we focus on fresh water and biodiversity. Starting on fresh water, we have 3 main categories of targets. One is about, these are these 3 blue boxes. One is about quantity. So we want to reduce our specific freshwater withdrawal. Another one is about quality. We want to ensure that all the 100% of the volume of the water we are discharging is in good quality. And the third one is a more innovative one, is about freshwater replenishment. We don't have time to go into the details, but just as an example, when I mentioned about we have measurable commitment, we do have, for example, for the cement business segment, on the right side, we have the targets. On the cement, we have a target to reduce by 33% by 2030 our specific freshwater withdrawal. And on aggregates business segment, 20%, and in concrete, 15%. This is all by 2030 when we compare to our 2018 baseline. So we don't have time to go into detail to the other, but just to give an example, when we talk about measurable commitments, what do we mean by that? If you go to the next slide, on biodiversity, our commitment is to a measurable positive impact on biodiversity by 2030. We have established some key milestones to reach to this commitment, to these targets. Both of the milestones, 2 milestones were reached in 2022. This is the first part of the slide on the left side. We are now measuring our biodiversity baseline in all our quarries, which is approximately 800 all over the world. And by 2024, we want to have this value, so the baseline assessed. And the idea is that we will then implement actions to increase the biodiversity value of our quarries by 2030. So then in 2030, we are going to measure again. And the idea is to, if we have a higher biodiversity index, it should say that we are moving towards a positive trajectory on biodiversity. If you go to the next slide. I think it's very important to say how we are measuring, or just to give you in a nutshell how we are measuring the biodiversity. We are using a methodology, a scientific methodology that was developed in partnership with the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, this NGO. And the methodology is very specific per ecosystem or habitat, how we call it in the methodology. And on the left side of the slide, you see the habitats we are focused on. And these are the ecosystems that we are evaluating the biodiversity. So for every single ecosystem, we have different questions to answer. So it's very tailor-made for ecosystem, this methodology to measure the biodiversity level, and is also tailor-made to our sector. We developed this whole thing with IUCN, but today this methodology is published, and all the other companies in the sector can use it as well. If you go to the next slide. So this slide is just to show to you that it's possible to restore and rehabilitate and have a higher biodiversity value than before. These photos were taken in Kenya in one of our quarries. And I went, by the way, to visit this site beginning of this year, and it's really, really impressive. It's exactly that, what you see in the screen. You see the right side nowadays, no, because this is the way that where we are today, but before was the left side. And there in Kenya, you see per year they were taking photos, and you really see a really huge progress. So the idea is that we want to replicate this case in all our quarries, of course, taking consideration the ecological condition from each region, because we cannot have forests everywhere. So if it's wetland, should be wetland. If it's grassland, should be grassland. But really taking consideration the endemic species and the ecological condition to every single site. But the idea is to improve the biodiversity at the end. If you go to next slide. This is just to show that because we have presence all over the world, it's important to have a consistent approach across countries. So we do have internally a nature policy, a water directive, and a biodiversity directive to help the countries to implement the approach and to make sure that we are consistent all over the countries and the sites. So we go to the next slide. You can skip this one. I don't think we have enough time, but if you go to the next one, because it's pretty much similar. Yeah, that one is an important one. So this is a summary on how we are reporting our indicators today. We publish some water and biodiversity indicators in our annual sustainability performance report. And here you see the indicators. They are quite small, but I think you guys are going to share the slides later on. You can also see in our sustainability report. We also have integrated profit and losses report where we monetize our environmental and social impacts, and we report also on an annual basis. And also we transparently disclose water and climate indicators through the CDP platform. If you go to the next slides. This is my last slide. Just to finalize, we all know that nature is catching up with climate, and all the companies, we need to be ready, as nature is going to be the new climate. That's what we are saying now. TNFD and SBTN will help us to bring our nature strategy to the next level. In case of Holcim, we had already a strategy, and now we are using these frameworks to bring us to the next level. And some other companies, when they do not develop yet, they can already use the framework and make sure that the strategy are in a good level. So, for example, just to give some examples, we pilot TNFD with a limited scope. We select a cement business, and also using a previous version of TNFD, of course, not this one, because it was just launched last week. But interesting to note is that one of the key outputs of this piloting was that we need to improve our risk management process at Holcim. We need to include ecosystem service and biodiversity questions into it. We do have quite robust climate and water risk management questions, but on the biodiversity side, we need to improve. Also, on the materiality assessment, it's much more robust also by using these frameworks, because it's now based on fact rather than in opinions. I think for everybody that's in this field for many years, in the sustainability field, previously, the materiality assessment were made by a stakeholder group consultation. And now we have tools that support us to assess based on facts what are the material impacts that we should focus on, impacts and dependencies, of course. And that, just to finalize, to conclude on the SBTN, I think we are one of the 17 companies piloting SBTN, and our plan is to validate our current targets, the ones that we have in our own operations. And if we need to adapt our current targets, we are going to do. But also we want to set measurable water and land targets based on size with our suppliers in the upstream, because this is a gap we have in our strategy, and we want to close the gap by implementing SBTN. That's everything I had to say, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion later on.
Thank you, Renata. A lot covered there. And yeah, I'm going to pass this immediately on to Owen Bethel from Nestle. And I think Renata just finished there by saying nature's the new climate. But I think, Owen, for Nestle, really, nature has always been climate for you, from what I understand. So yeah, tell us how you've been approaching these frameworks and indeed your nature kind of strategy overall.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And good to be here today. For those of you who don't know Nestle, we're a global food and beverage business based in Switzerland. We've been around for a while and we make lots of different types of product. And all of that relies on Mother Nature and all of the different supply chains that we have in different countries around the world. And when I refer to supply chains, I mean things like coffee and cocoa and milk and all the other ingredients that go into making what we make and sell. So really, from a dependencies perspective, nature's always been important to our company. And the theme of the presentation today really is to talk about climate as the entry point to addressing nature. And for us, really, the two things have always been kind of integrated given the nature of our company and what we rely on in terms of those natural resources. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So first of all, we moved, I would say, pretty early on climate. I remember 4 years ago going to New York Climate Week and launching our net zero commitment, which at the time was fairly revolutionary in our industry because it covered all three scopes and set ourselves the challenging objective of a 50% reduction by 2030, which of course is what is required to stick to a 1.5 degree pathway. We followed that up with a detailed roadmap about 1 year later, and we've also been working on assessing our risks and impacts from a climate perspective for some time as well. So our first TCFD aligned report happened in 2021 based on the year end 2020. So very soon after we published our roadmap. And now we're kind of looking at ways of integrating that reporting into our actual annual review, which is where all of our financial numbers go. And that will happen from next year onwards. So climate is kind of being integrated, if you like, into our financial planning and our business planning and our reporting as a company. And we're also looking ahead to forthcoming mandatory requirements, which are coming in under regulation in the European Union, to which we are subject as a company that operates in that space. So if we can go to the next slide. As I sort of introduced, climate actions are largely nature actions at Nestle because we rely on this big land footprint, right, for our success. And that land has an effect on climate in terms of emissions. It also has an effect on nature in terms of biodiversity and water and land use and even oceans as well to a certain extent. So some of the key actions that we have to reach net zero include ending the risk of deforestation. And very happy to say that we've already reached 99% verified deforestation free for our main at-risk commodities. Reforestation within our value chain, so what used to be called an insetting framework, but now is referred to as Scope 3 removals. Rolling out regenerative agriculture, and we want to do that for 50% of our key ingredients by the end of the decade. And also landscape level work. So we prioritize 15 places in the world where we can bring together forestry and agriculture and other forms of land use to make sure that we have an impact across the landscape and it's not just a patchwork of interventions which don't really add up to a nature positive effect. So that is something that's reflected in the SBTN framework, and we're also one of the companies, one of the 17 who are piloting the target setting through SBTN at the moment, and we're looking at things like our landscape level interventions as part of that. Next slide, please. So from a sort of, if we put ourselves a TNFD lens on and we think about risks, then the physical and transition risks that we've already mapped on climate, again, are nature-based, right? So we're talking here about things like the effect of drought or too much water, flooding on key commodities, such as coffee. Coffee is one of those ones that's really at risk because it's very sensitive to temperature and condition changes. Coffee can only grow at certain altitudes and with certain temperatures and humidity levels. And if those change, then no more coffee in those areas, which is obviously a strategic risk to our company. It's also a potential opportunity through our work on supporting farmers and growing more drought-resistant varieties of coffee and other types of intervention that we're working on. But it's not just limited to that, of course. Things like water shortages can affect all sorts of crops and all sorts of animal livestock in systems as well. So really kind of looking at nature risks makes a lot of sense for us as a company, and is very intimately tied into our net zero ambition as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of nature, I won't sort of bore you with all the details here, but just to say that we've been very active on this agenda. We supported the Make It Mandatory campaign at CBD COP15 last year. We were very pleased to see that come through. And we've been working on identifying the ways in which we can live up to that call to action. I've talked about science-based targets for nature already. We're also strong supporters of the work of Business for Nature and its ongoing work to persuade companies to really lean into this agenda. We've also been active on advocacy in the European Union this year with a little bit of a heated debate about nature and the nature restoration law in the European context. But really kind of that's going to continue because it's really core to our strategy to make sure that we have all forces, all stakeholders operating in the same direction when it comes to rolling out the right kind of forestry projects, the right kind of regen ag and landscape interventions, and making sure that that actually ladders up to a much bigger impact than we can deliver just as one company. Next slide, please. So in terms of reporting and using these frameworks, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that there is significant regulation coming in. So I've mentioned CSRD and ESRS. We're planning for that at the moment. Making sure that we meet legal requirements is obviously a complete baseline for any company, but the level of compliance is significantly increasing, and that requires resourcing. I think the interesting thing there is around materiality. So if we move to the second column and we think about TNFD, there is a materiality-based approach, which for a company like ours will put nature near the top of the importance ladder, and therefore disclosure under ESRS will largely match what TNFD is trying to create as well through its framework. But we also support a level of convergence where possible. So we've had the political framework coming in through the GBF. We've had voluntary measures that TNFD has proposed. We also have compliance, and really kind of bringing that together is a good thing for companies like ours because it means there's greater comparability between different players in the sector, and it drives a higher level playing field for all to aspire to. Next slide, please. So a little bit of a sneak peek here to a publication that we're working on right now. It's going to be hopefully published on the 14th of November. And that is about just providing even more detail on how we're going in this direction, including some further information about our impacts, along with the dependencies piece, which I think is quite clear for most stakeholders for Nestle, and also some further granularity on our climate journey and how we're tackling that topic as a flag company. So really kind of explaining how the flag sector has a unique opportunity to leverage natural resources to tackle the climate crisis, but also deliver further co-benefits as well. Next slide, please. And then just to finish off with a couple of little examples of how we do this in our supply chain. So this example was actually used as part of the TNFD launch to demonstrate the LEAP methodology in action. So what we did here was we combined satellite monitoring with on-the-ground verification to map our value chains for palm oil in a specific province in Indonesia. And the reason for doing that was to get much more granular detail on where the risks might be in terms of deforestation, and then to drive appropriate actions for each local context. And what this did was it helped map and confirm where our suppliers were sourcing from, which mills they were supplying to, and then gave us really detailed information on key areas to watch. And we actually have a system which provides us with real-time alerts on where deforestation risk might be taking place, connected to areas near to our sourcing activities. And then we can assess where we should intervene and where things are not directly connected to what we're doing. So palm oil is actually very, very advanced now, perhaps unsurprising, as it's one of those supply chains that received a lot of pressure in the past. And then let's go to the final slide, conscious of time. The final one is just a kind of a quick highlight on peatlands, the absolutely critical role of peatlands, of course. We heard about that earlier, sequestering and storing huge amounts of carbon. And because of where we source from, peatlands are often adjacent to our palm oil supply shed as well. And so they can form a really integral part of what we're doing on carbon removals and also maintaining biodiverse ecosystems. So the focus on peatlands makes sense beyond carbon. It makes sense from a water quality perspective, a social perspective, and we want to make sure that they're part of our actions as well on our climate roadmap, but also as we lean into the nature agenda more. So to conclude, lots of stuff happening at SA on the nature agenda, but it's really just a continuation of what we've done on climate, with more granularity to come in the near future. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Owen. And thank you for the work you're doing, identifying the risks but the opportunities to maintain peatlands. That's great to hear. I want to come back to some of the implications of those incoming regulations, like the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that you mentioned, if we have time. But for now, we'll just go to our last presentation of the webinar, which is from Deepshika Singh, who is Head of Stewardship and Deputy Head of Sustainable Investment Research at La Française Asset Management. So you're going to give us a bit of a sneak peek into your Climate Nature Nexus report, and kind of headlines from that. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and giving us the opportunity to launch this guide. I want to say that this is not a new framework. This is not another requirement for corporates or for financial institutions. It is more of a how-to guide, because currently, as we have seen all through this presentation,
Deepshika, just 1 second, because your audio is coming through a little bit rumbly. So maybe just try and be a bit closer to your microphone, just because we want to hear everything you say. Might be doing the old headphone switch, which I catch myself doing quite a lot. And while we wait for her to come back, I think she was making the point that what she's presenting now isn't one of the frameworks as such, but is a piece of guidance that this asset management company, on behalf of the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation, has put together. You're on mute, but hopefully when you're not on mute, we'll be able to hear you better.
Hello. Is this better?
Good. Sounds good. Go for it.
Okay, sorry. I was using the hands-free. It doesn't work. So, yeah. Yes, starting from the beginning. So thanks for inviting me and giving us the opportunity to pre-launch this guide. The guide will be launched in its final version next month, in 2 weeks' time, just before the European Business and Nature Summit on 10th or 11th of October. I want to emphasize, I have already said that this is not another framework, but more of a how-to guide for financial institutions of all kinds. So asset managers and banks, insurance firms, and all kinds of financial institutions on how to assimilate all the information that is out there on both climate and nature. I'm sure that we all suffer from this decision paralysis on which to prioritize and what to ignore without running the risk of hampering nature or climate. So that's why, thank you, Finance for Biodiversity, Anita and Anne-Marie, for giving us the opportunity for all financial institutions to come together and collectively improve our understanding on all the topics that are out there. I also want to thank my co-authors. who were from all kinds of financial institutions. Let's start then. So next slide, please. Yes, so as we have seen all through the presentations on, especially from Holcim and Nestle, that biodiversity and climate are so interrelated. A lot of targets, net zero targets that are out there, they need biodiversity solutions to have a positive impact on climate, and vice versa. So, but we also, so there are a lot of synergies between biodiversity and climate targets and strategies out there. But at the same time, during the course of a study on this very important topic, we have realized that there are also some trade-offs that we need to consider as financial institutions, as project managers, as landowners, or as corporates. And it is very important that we do not fall in the trap of ignoring one for the other. Next slide, please. This is a small graphic to visualize how the climate biodiversity nexus looks like. So the pillar 1 is on the left bottom. You can see that it represents actions, human activities that are negative for both climate and biodiversity, because we all know that climate change is one of the direct drivers of nature loss today, and it is highly expected to be the biggest driver of nature loss by 2050. Pillar 2 represents the opportunity, which is that biodiversity conservation is necessary for all climate action, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, from green infrastructure to regenerative agriculture to even nature-based solutions. We need biodiversity solutions to enhance climate action. On pillar 3 and pillar 4, we show that not all solutions, whether it is for biodiversity or climate, are positive for the other. So there are solutions like, actually we can move to the next slide, it will make more sense. So in this slide, you can see there are some of the activities that we have tried to map. This is not a quantitative mapping, this is more of an illustration of the concept. And so you can see that we have listed a lot of activities. Not all have been covered in the paper, but we have tried to cover the most important ones. So agriculture, we have covered plastics, we have covered circular economy solutions in terms of food waste, electronics recycling. We have covered nature-based solutions, and we have also covered all kinds of alternative energy, biofuels, solar, wind, hydropower, and tried to analyze what synergies and trade-offs are there and how financial institutions should be addressing these. So I want to emphasize on one point, that on pillar 3, you can see that there are certain solutions that can be undertaken to combat biodiversity loss or nature loss in general. So for example, we are in a water crisis. We have a scarcity of water all around the globe. So desalination is one of the biggest solutions that is there for combating water scarcity. But if desalination is run on fossil fuels, it is bound to be negative for climate change. So unless and until we have renewable energy powered desalination plants, it is highly probable that we will end up having a higher climate change. We end up increasing global warming and hence hampering biodiversity loss and vice versa. It is a vicious cycle. And this is what we wanted to analyze and understand in this paper. On the next slide, I present, next slide, please. Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize on nature-based solutions, given that Climate Catalyst does work on peatlands restoration but nature-based solutions are one of the biggest avenue which corporates and financial institutions are implementing for climate action, for climate mitigation and adaptation as well. But nature-based solution projects could present trade-offs for biodiversity and also for the wider society, as IUCN demonstrate in the graph on the right. There are a lot of elements that we need to consider before deciding on going for nature-based solutions as a as a solution for climate action. Whenever there is a nature-based solution, an ecosystem restoration project where it might not be needed, or it is promoting monoculture forests or monoculture ecosystems, or even when we are planting non-native trees in some areas, then it can be detrimental to the local biodiversity and also reduce the availability of water and land for other purposes, which could be vital for the survival of human species and others as well. So we recommend that financial institutions should definitely still invest in nature-based solutions. As we stand today, only 2%, I think only 2% of the available nature-based solutions that are being financed. So definitely we should continue investments in nature-based solutions, but we have to take into account the disadvantages for biodiversity and society and trade-offs that these create. We can learn from EU taxonomy and adopt the do no significant harm approach when we are analyzing nature-based solutions that are being used by corporates or nature-based solutions that are being financed by ourselves, including their impact on biodiversity and on social issues, on indigenous communities is an important part of TNFD framework as well. And so we have to take into consideration all these elements when we are financing and investing in any of these projects. And we can also take help from benchmarks and certifications that exist out there when we are trying to invest in nature-based solutions. On the last slide, next slide, please. I summarize the 5 key recommendations that we have for financial institutions to address the nexus, address the biodiversity climate nexus. It is not a step-by-step process. It has to be integrated at every element of our business process and our thinking about environment, society, and economy all together. We should continue to finance energy generating solutions and minimize the trade-offs that come from our investments. Identify and prioritize the sectors with a materiality approach that has been promoted by TNFD, SBTN, and everybody. Engage with the companies. Engagement, I want to emphasize on this, that is the best way to learn and to create impact. Once we have more studies on sector-specific guidance and disclosures, we can set up sector-based policies on limiting our trade-offs and enhancing synergies from the companies and projects that we invest in or finance in. And finally, we should integrate biodiversity into climate-based targets, policy, and reporting that we already have. And that is a very low-hanging fruit that I think financial institutions can start doing today, because unless and until we think and implement both biodiversity and climate targets and policy in one go, we risk falling in the trap of ignoring one for the other, and that is obviously not what we want to do. I'll keep it short. I know that we are out of time. So yeah, that's it. Over to you. Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Thank you. It's excellent to have this guidance for financial institutions, which, as you say, helps us stop falling into that trap. So we're moving into the Q&A, and our panelists have been actually quite busy in the background, starting to answer your questions that you put in the Q&A function in the chat. So do have a look in the answered panel. But we're gonna tackle a few of these live questions in the last 10 minutes that we have. So Marianne, I was hoping if I could come to you first. So there's a question, well, you've got 2 questions here, but if we take this second one, the question is about kind of the common challenge or opportunity that you see many businesses that when they have been using the framework, they have been reporting on, where they're kind of identifying a challenge or an opportunity that perhaps they wouldn't have done without using the framework. So what has it enabled them to do? What trends are you seeing?
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, just to let you know that, of course, the piloting has not yet been done on the final framework, as we also heard from Holcim, since it was only released Monday last week. And actually what we did in the sort of last part of the sprint was to add the opportunity, the positive impact drivers as core metrics, because that was actually some of the feedback from the market through the piloting, was what are you actually incentivizing if you're only saying it's the negative impact drivers and impacts that are the core and mandatory. It's actually, you need to include the positive. So it's only last minute that we have included the positive side. But I think it very much follows from what Owen was saying, that a lot of the opportunities the businesses have found just from a sort of business efficiency perspective has been to recycle the physical climate risk data for nature. So especially on the metrics on water scarcity, but also on the plastic footprint and also on land conversion, etc. That just as Nestle has done, that there's actually sort of a stack of data you can mine and repurpose that for nature. So there's quite a lot of efficiency gains there. And also just from one of the first one that has done an actually TNFD disclosure, a line disclosure statement, which is United Utilities in the UK. They have identified quite a number of concrete opportunities of working with the farmers in the watersheds to incentivize them through KPI-linked credits for them to reduce their fertilizer and pesticide use, for United Utilities to be able to have better ecosystem services of fresh water, clean water provisioning to their clients. So I think these types of new type of collaborative models where you can improve the ecosystem services that the businesses depend on are some of the more sort of promising and more concrete one. I can definitely inspire you to look at the United Utilities case. It's completely open. It's very interesting.
Okay, everyone should be looking that up. Okay, I'm gonna get some more quick fire questions. We've got a question here, the latest one that's come in, that I'm going to direct at you, Renata, which is, are the nature and biodiversity reports that were part of your presentation completely independent of your financial disclosures, your kind of 10Ks or accounting reports, or in what ways do they intersect? That'd be interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So today we publish is a different report, and there's a big but. What we are doing internally is that we are making sure that our indicators of sustainability are integrated with the finance tool. So we use SAP internally for finance disclosures and collection of data, and we are doing the same with nature and climate. So climate is fully embedded with the financial tool. Nature, we have water indicators already, and we are starting to include the biodiversity ones. So it's integrated, but at the end we put in different reports, but internally it's all in the same system, because we want to ensure that, you know, the finance KPI or sustainability KPIs should be seen and should be taken into account with the same robustness as the financial KPIs and indicators.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to come to Owen next, actually, because as I said, I was interested, as you noted in your presentation, we have the incoming EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and you mentioned that will kind of drive prioritization of your strategies, of how you're assessing the material impacts. So can you tell us a little bit about how you see the TNFD recommendations providing additional guidance, leading to kind of maybe more identification of risks and opportunities? How do you see those two things working together for it to be additional, and how can the TNFD lead you towards more of those quick wins that I think you said?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So as I mentioned, compliance is a necessary thing for all companies. We all have to do it, and the compliance requirements are significantly increasing through ESRS and CSRD. ESRS is the kind of more specific element to our sector as a company. And what's common between the two is this focus on materiality. So assessing your key material risks and impacts, and then setting out a strategy for addressing them. The difference really is in the kind of level of detail and the number of metrics which would be reported under the two systems. So What we can do is there are, as you said, quick wins. So, I mean, GHG emissions, right, for example, is one metric in TNFD, right? We already do that. We've been doing that for a long time. Water is another one which we've been looking at through things like CDP, which will also form part of our disclosure under CSRD. So there's kind of synergies that you can identify. Governance is another one that we've been looking at. So how do you address nature-related risks and opportunities in the structure of your company, in addition to climate? So kind of making that explicit. That's a fairly quick thing you can do and relatively uncontroversial in the scheme of things. But I think our kind of general approach is to focus on compliance first and encourage the work of TNFD at the same time, because it helps raise awareness and it helps raise the same kind of standards and levels in different parts of the world as well, because not everybody's going to report against CSRD. There will be other parts of the world where that's not the case. So we see the two things coming together, and we want to support that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. I'm going to finish off with just a couple of more questions. There's an interesting one here from Joe McKenna. What's a term emerging that captures climate and nature aspects together? So my quick response to that would be something like planetary boundaries. That seems to be a term that's kind of talking about, obviously the limits that the limits that we could place both on how we're going to impact our climate and nature. But Michael, you might have a piffier answer to that. And indeed, I'll put this question to you about what support is there to help businesses and investors kind of disclose and take part in some of these frameworks.
Yeah, there's no simple answer to that. I think you're right. The whole discussion around planetary boundaries, of course, encompasses both the climate, nature, but also the social side, which is a really key piece that many of the companies working on nature disclosure also need to ensure that there is that just transition piece on society embedded. But I think on the nature side, we have seen also in New York the launch of the Nature Positive Initiative, which really also tries to make sure that nature is put on the agenda, and the nature positive narratives kind of sits side by side with the net zero conversations that are happening. So it's not necessarily a conversation that will totally encompass climate, but at least make sure that we're having conversation on net zero and nature positive as the sort of long-term goals that society needs to work towards. That when we're talking about climate, we also know that nature is indeed the opposite side of that coin, and we need to address both to be able to live in a planetary that is safe and operational for humans and the nature within it. In terms of your second question around the support, I think it's evident from this call again that we have a lot of resources, specifically to assess impact and dependencies, other resources and mechanisms that are available. The Natural Capital Protocol is one of those resources that help companies not only assess but value and evaluate put a value on on nature within this business operations and value chain. So that's definitely a piece. And of course, when it comes to evaluating the risks, but also the opportunities, TNFD now does a really good job of making sure that all of those elements are included in the assessments that companies are doing. Through Business for Nature, we're also encouraging companies to make sure that they're conducting assessments that are not only focused on nature or climate, but really bringing in the climate and social elements to ensure that we're having these holistic processes. I'll put in a link to the chat to a ton of resources from We Value Nature, WWF on water risk and biodiversity tools that can support businesses in really conducting those assessments to be able to meaningfully report on the impacts and dependencies.
Thanks, Michael. And actually, I think that's a good note to end on. And also, in the slides that we'll send out, we also have a list of resources that that will be really helpful. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to everybody also, please do look at the answers to the questions in the chat. Martha's been given some really good answers there about data. So we'll summarize that and also send that out with the kind of follow-up from this. So I just lastly to say, kind of to summarize the next steps here, and this follows the kind of Act D framework that Michael laid out earlier. Yeah, we call on you to obviously assess your impacts, to commit to targets, to take industry initiatives to the likes that Michael was just talking about in terms of the sector kind of pathways and guidance. Of course, disclose, which has been at the heart of this webinar today, and be aware of some of the compliance needs that are coming in, which are good to see. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you for everybody for attending. Yeah, and do get in touch with us. Madeline's email address is just right here, and we'll send out some resources after we hang up here. Thank you. Thanks everyone. Have a good day. Bye.